You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control of our resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When we talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. One group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right. Professor Chomsky, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. The local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. It's a soundbite that says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours.
We've got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay, well,
and they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
This is Democracy's Diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives, a place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer.
The process by which people make up their minds on this is a much more mysterious process than you would ever guess from reading Manufacturing Consent. There is a saying about legislation that legislation is like making sausage. That the less you know about how it's done, the better for your appetite. The same is true of this business. If you're in a conference in which decisions are being made on what to put on page one or whatnot, you would get, I think, the impression that important decisions were being made in a flippant and frivolous way. But in fact, given the pressures of time to trying to get things out, you resort to a kind of a shorthand. And you have to fill that paper up every day. It's curious in a kind of a mirror image way that Professor Chomsky is in total accord with Reed Irvine, who at the right-wing end of the spectrum says exactly what Chomsky does about the insinuating influence of the press, of the big media, as, quote, agenda setters, to use one of the great buzzwords of the time. And, of course, Reed Irvine sees this as a left-wing conspiracy of foisting liberal ideas in both domestic and foreign affairs on the American people. But in both cases, I think that the premise really is an insult to the intelligence of the people who consume news.
Now, to eliminate confusion, all of this has nothing to do with liberal or conservative bias. According to the propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively. In other words, if the press is indeed adversarial and liberal and all these bad things, then how can I go beyond it? They're already so extreme in their opposition to power that to go beyond it would be to take off from the planet. So therefore, it must be that the presuppositions that are accepted in the liberal media are sacrosanct, can't go beyond them. And a well-functioning system would in fact have a bias of that kind. The media would then serve to say, in effect, thus far and no further. We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them? The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates, so for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. You know?
Except, I guess, at a certain level, I think, like, I guess I work with student press, so I know, like, reporters and stuff.
The elites don't control the student press, but I'll tell you something. You try in the student press to do anything that breaks out of conventions, and you're going to have the whole business community around here down on your neck, and the university's going to get threatened, and, you know, I mean, maybe nobody will pay any attention to you, that's possible. But if you get to the point where they don't stop paying attention to you, the pressures will start coming. Because there are people with power. There are people who own the country, and they're not going to let the country get out of control. So what we have in the first place is major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world, that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional.
Sometimes it's hard to understand the concept of censorship when we have so many options for news. There are hundreds of TV stations, newspapers, and radio shows. But the truth is that almost every avenue from which we get our information in the mainstream media is controlled by only 6 corporations that have one specific interest: profit. News censorship is happening every day, but not necessarily from the top down blacking out the stories, but also in the form of self-censorship, framing, backpaging, all to protect the interests of those corporate conglomerates. So who are the big 6 corporations that control nearly everything you see, hear, and read? First, there's Comcast, formerly owned by GE, which controls MSNBC, NBC, and Telemundo. And there's Disney, which owns ABC, the History Channel, and and ESPN. Next, Viacom, the parent company of MTV, Paramount, and BET. And CBS, with all its affiliates. And there's News Corp, which owns Fox News, the New York Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And finally, Time Warner, the parent company of CNN, Time, and People magazine, as well as Warner Brothers. So what impact does it have when an agency that's supposed to serve as a watchdog for the powerful becomes a lapdog for the powerful? To break down some of the most egregious cases of censorship and conflicts of interest in the corporate media, BTS producer Manuel Rapalo.
Hi, Abby. How's it going?
Hi, what's going on? So,
good.
You know, when I think of the top-down censorship, kind of the hand of the corporation blacking out a story, 2 cases come to mind that are the most egregious. The first one was News Corp. Fox News was going to air a story on the bovine growth hormone, BGH, bovine growth hormone, of course, another Monsanto case of censorship where they were invested in Monsanto for advertising, and their boss said no when a team of Fox investigative reporters wanted to cover this story. Monsanto threatened the station, sent them a letter saying there will be dire consequences, this is a direct quote, dire consequences for Fox News if the story is aired, and I wanted to play what happened when they confronted their boss about this.
I said, you know, this is news. This is important. This is stuff people need to know. And I'll never forget, he didn't pause a beat, and he said, we just paid $3 billion for these television stations. We'll tell you what the news is. The news is what we say it is.
So really, I mean, you know, you look at this case, and it's such an egregious case of censorship, and really he's saying, we'll tell you what the news is. The news is whatever we want it to be. The news is whatever our advertisers want it to be.
No, it's not just, when it comes to the media, really, it's not just the parent companies. It's also your corporate sponsors. It's also the people that are putting out the ads. I mean, Monsanto, had this story actually aired, would have probably pulled their advertisement for Roundup, for aspartame, and all those other products that again, aren't tested, but advertise all over Fox News. And it's really interesting that you point out this story, because the reporters and that guy that you just played, they actually countersued against Fox under Florida's whistleblower statute. And as it turns out, under Florida law, they lost that lawsuit because turns out it's not illegal to falsify the news. So, I mean, that really should give you an idea of how dangerous this is and how powerful Monsanto is. Like, they've been doing this for...
Yeah, they've been doing this for the past 10 years. Once again, another labeling issue. We're seeing Monsanto censoring stories. You also were researching a story about ABC.
Sure. This is just another one of those examples. Back in 1998, kind of a very clear-cut example. ABC was 2020, they were going to air this story about how Disneyland is actually hiring pedophiles. I mean, it's just a crazy story. You're thinking a theme park for kids, and pedophiles just sounds terrible. They weren't able to pull the story. Why? Because Disney owns ABC. It's very clear cut. You don't want to endanger or make the corporate interests look bad. So, I mean, that's one of those clear-cut stories. But, I mean, it also raises questions. That one's relatively easy, not to downplay pedophiles, but when you look at cases like CNN's running a story about the BP oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon spill, about the cleanup efforts and how, things are getting better. And as soon as the segment's over, you see a commercial come on, and it's BP, and it's BP representatives going, come down to the coast and eat some one-eyed shrimp or whatever they're doing. I mean, there's a problem in there, and it's so obvious, but I think people don't realize it as much as it's in your face.
They don't realize it, but Project Censored, one of the greatest research organizations in the country about censorship in the media, did a study where they found that 118 people only sit on 288 corporate boards that unify kind of this media conglomerate and corporate America. So you have people involved in Kraft Foods, Monsanto, so many different things, defense corporations, the pharmaceutical industry, lobbying together, all sitting on these boards, and it really is such a small amount of people really controlling all these things from the top down.
It's 6
What
corporations.
are some of the most shocking things that you found in terms of just conflicts of interest?
I was looking at this, and when we're looking at conflict of interest, there's 2 things that really need to be pointed out. It's not just corporations. A lot of execs that sit in corporations and you said it in your introduction, they're sitting on, for example, NBC, Citigroup, Exxon, Philip Morris. Their execs sit on board of directors for Philip Morris. That's not okay. CBS has board members sitting in Walmart, General Dynamics. These are drone manufacturers. The execs for CBS are the same guys that are sitting in the board of directors for drone manufacturers?
And I think
how is that okay?
And I think when people think of the corporate media, they're like, oh, well, of course, the corporate media. But really, we're talking about NPR and PBS as well. I mean, NPR was running a story during the BP oil spill featuring a scientist that was talking about how oil was in the Gulf that would bacteria that would eat the oil. It was like, well, this bacteria is just going to clean up the oil itself. We don't have to worry about anything. Turns out later, according to Greg Palast, that the scientist interviewed about the story was given $500 million, $500 million dollars from BP. NPR never mentioned this detail, this quaint detail, when they were doing the story. And of course, we saw PBS.
The thing about that, the money that, I mean, we're talking about one guy that received $500 million. That money, that money actually spread out. It was more like a money spill, is what Greg Palast said in that report that he did. So you've got all these universities, all these independent researchers all over the country doing research on oil biology, and they're all being funded by BP.
And PBS aired the drone documentary by Lockheed Martin, pretty much a promo for drones. And us talking about all of this really calls into question. The U.S. State Department issued a warning about restricted press freedom in the rest of the world, meanwhile ignoring that the consolidation of 90% of the U.S. media by 6 corporations. I mean, really, we're ranked 32 in the world in press freedom here.
Exactly, and I know that we had an infographic somewhere. I wonder if we can pull it up. If not, it shows, between 1983 and now, you're gone from this multitude of media organizations in the country and really narrowing it down to 6. 6 that control nearly everything that we see and watch in this country, everything that we see and watch. And these organizations, they're also making political contributions. So, they're throwing money into both sides of the equation, Democrats and Republicans, and they get back those special connections and inside information, turning talking points into news, essentially.
Indeed they do. Thank you so much. Manuel Rapalo, BTS producer.
Thanks, Abby.